So Leviticus 17:11 says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it to you on the altar to make atonement for your soul. For it is the blood that makes atonement for the soul." That's why there had to be blood spilled, because that's what you need to make atonement. Atonement for sin. Back in the garden, when Adam and Eve fell, he covered them with skins. There was an animal sacrifice at that point, and the blood side of the skin was against the flesh of man. It's a symbol. So what I want to do is we're going to go read real quick through Exodus 12, the story of Passover, and then jump in to this whole teaching. This is where Moses goes to Pharaoh in the last plague, the death angel, and he gives them instructions. This is how you survive this. You need to do something specific. So I want to read through it real quick just so we all see it. And it's always good to read the Bible anyway. So Exodus 12. "Now the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in the land of Egypt, saying, This month shall be your beginning of months. It shall be the first month of the year to you. Speak to all the congregation of Israel, saying, On the 10th day of the month you shall take for himself a lamb according to his house, his father, a lamb for his household." So the 10th day of the month they take a lamb. "If the household is too small for the lamb, let him and his neighbor next to his house take it according to the number of persons. According to each man's need, you shall make the count for the lamb. Your lamb shall be without blemish, a male of the first year. You may take it from the sheep or the goats. Now you shall keep it until the 14th day of the month. Then the whole assembly of the congregation shall kill it at twilight." So they bring the lamb in on the 10th day of the month, and they keep it until the 14th. The reason for that is so they can get close to it. They need to learn to love it. They need to learn to care for this thing. It's an animal. It's a part of their family now. A sacrifice is only if you give up something that you don't want to give up. So imagine if a puppy dies somewhere in Mars Hill. You don't know about it. You don't really care because you don't know about it. But if you take a puppy into your house for 4 days, at the 4th day you love it, and now you have to kill it. God wants you to feel what he has to feel when he had to send his son. "And they shall take some of the blood and put it on 2 doorposts and on the lintel of the houses where they eat it. They shall eat it with the flesh on that night, roasted in fire, with unleavened bread, and with bitter herbs they shall eat it. Do not eat it raw, nor boiled with water, but roasted in fire, its head with its legs and its entrails. You shall let none of it remain until morning, and what remains of it until morning you shall burn with fire. And thus you shall eat it, with your belt around your waist, with your sandals on your feet, your staff in your hand, so you shall eat it in haste, for this is the Lord's Passover." Now, it does not say this is the Jews' Passover. This is not a Jewish thing. This is the Passover to God, the Lord's Passover. Keep that in mind, because people have thought that Passover is a Jewish thing. This is before there were even Jews mentioned in the Bible. Jews are from Judah, the tribe of Judah. This is for everybody. "For I will pass through the land of Egypt on that night, and I will strike the firstborn in the land of Egypt, both man and beast, and against the gods of Egypt I will execute judgment. For I am the Lord. Now the blood shall be a sign for you on the houses where you are. And when I see the blood, I will pass over you, and the plague shall not be on you to destroy you when I strike the land of Egypt." The blood is a sign that you're going to be protected. But you had to follow all those steps to be protected. "So this day shall be to you a memorial, and you shall keep it as a feast to the Lord throughout all your generations. You shall keep it as a feast, as an everlasting ordinance. Notice this doesn't say you shall remember this until the cross. Forget about it after that. It says keep this as a feast for all generations, because he wants you to remember it. Every year he wants you to remember, this is what I did. And we talked about how the unleavened bread is coming out of slavery last time. You are a slave to sin, and this sets you free from sin. It's about what it is. It's protection, it's the covering of the blood, and pulling you out of slavery into the arms of the Creator. That's what it's all about. So why wouldn't we want to remember that? Why we just want to let the Jews remember that? Now, we all pretty much know that story from the Ten Commandments movies and all these other reproductions of the movies. But there's other things that are going on here. So I'm going to talk a minute about the threshold covenant. I talked about this a little bit last year. I want to go over it again so everybody knows what it means. The primitive altar of the family would have been the threshold or the door seal, or the entranceway of the home or the dwelling place. This is indicated in surviving customs. In the East and elsewhere among primitive people, and by the earliest historic records of the human race, this is obvious that the houses preceded temples, and that the house father was the earliest priest. Sacrifices for the family were therefore within the entrance of the family home, family domicile. We see this in the story of Job. We see this in the story of Abraham. Abraham sat at the door of his tent. That was the entrance to his house. The threshold, we see it now at the bottom of our doors, was the altar of the home. Whatever you allowed on the altar, you allowed into your house. And there was covenants made there at the altar. Abraham protected his family. He done business at the doorway. And this is a sign of Christ, because Christ says, I am the door. All right, inside the home is where the bridal chambers are. And you cannot come into the house except going by the door. And how you do that, you have to cross the threshold. In Syria and in Egypt, at the present time, when a guest who is worthy of special honor is to be welcomed into the home, the blood of a slaughtered or a sacrificed animal is shed on the threshold of that home as a means of adopting a newcomer into the family, or for making a covenant union with him. They would actually kill the lamb or whatever animal they picked at the doorpost as a sign that a covenant is made between me and you, and if you accept it, you are now welcome into my house. While the guest is still outside, the host takes a lamb or a goat and, tying its feet together, lays it upon the threshold of the door. Resting his left knee upon the bound victim, the host holds the head by his left hand, while the right hand cuts his throat. He retains this position until all the blood is flowed out from the body upon the threshold. Then the victim is removed, and the guest steps over the blood across the threshold, and in this act he becomes, as it were, a member of the family by the threshold covenant. He who goes in by the door must count himself and must be recognized as a guest, subject to the strictest laws of hospitality. But if he enters the house some other way, not crossing the threshold, there is not so much implied covenant on his part. He may then even despoil or kill the head of the house without any breach of the law of hospitality or the moral law as it is understood. Now what this means is, you have the laws of your house. We hear this all the time. As long as you're in my house, you're going to obey my rules. In this custom, you sacrifice an animal on your door seal. Blood flows on the door seal. Everybody sees it. And if you cross over that covenant and accept it into that house, you say, I'm part of your home. I will abide by your rules. This is what God is trying to say. If you want to be protected, now think of Egypt, the blood around the door. You come in, I'll protect you, but you have to abide by my rules. That's what he's saying. And you're saying, I accept your rules. I accept your laws by doing this. If you come into the house some other way, you're considered a thief. You want to sneak in the back way, if you have a tent, you want to cut the back of the tent, enter, you're considered a thief or a robber or somebody that means harm. And this can be seen in the Bible in John 10. Jesus says, verily, verily, I say to you, he that enters not by the door into the sheepfold, but climbs up some other way, the same is a thief and a robber. But he that enters by the door is the shepherd of the sheep. That's what Jesus meant by that. If you come into the house some other way, you don't recognize the covenant. There is no covenant made. Does this make sense? I'm going to show you some pictures. This is an ancient threshold into a door. And then if you can look right here, there's a gutter. This is where the blood would be poured along here and down into that. Here's another picture. You can really see the bowl there. This is where they would fill the blood up. That's called the basin. This is the trench here. Now what that also does is it lets everybody else in the neighborhood or the village know a covenant was made at that house. I can see the blood. Something must have happened. Maybe it was a wedding, because back then weddings were arranged. Somebody was to come here and say, I have a bride for your son. They kill an animal. Then the bride is now picked up and carried over the threshold. That's where that custom comes from. Carrying the bride across the threshold. And you are not allowed to step on the threshold like this guy is, or in the blood. If you do, it shows contempt. It shows you don't respect the covenant. That's mentioned in the Bible. This is what it would have looked like as a drawing. Now think about the Exodus. God tells Moses, take some of the blood and put it around the doorpost and the top, out of the basin, out of the bowl. There was already a covenant made on the threshold. But God says, I want you to take some of that blood and put it around the door. Right? This is a picture of what an ancient doorway would have looked like in Egypt or another country that they worship many gods. All these are different aspects of some sort of God, and even on the door itself. That would have been customary. The Egyptians would have done this. Hebrews wouldn't have done that unless they were slaves in somebody else's house. So by the covenant, this is saying, whoever lived in this home, I want these gods to protect my home. That's my entrance. Whatever comes in that entrance, these gods are going to protect me. And our God says, all I want to see is blood. One thing it does, if you don't have anything on there, it shows a covenant. If you do have gods around the door, it covers them up. It hides them. All those gods would have been hidden by the blood. If anyone stepped on the threshold or stepped in the blood, they showed contempt or disrespect for the host and to the family of the home. They had ill intentions. This is why in Hebrews, for if we sin willfully after we have received the knowledge of the truth, there is no longer remains a sacrifice for sins, but a certain fearful expectation of judgment, and a fiery indignation which will devour the adversaries. Anyone who has rejected Moses and dies without mercy on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses, of how much worse punishment do you suppose will be thought worthy who has trampled the Son of God underfoot? This means stepping on the covenant. Counted the blood of the covenant by which it was sacrificed a common thing, and insulted the Spirit of grace. For we know him who said, vengeance is mine, I will repay, says the Lord. And again, the Lord will judge his people. So trampling the God underfoot means stepping on the threshold after a covenant's been made, stepping in the blood, or even counting the blood as a common thing. Most churches now don't teach about the sacrifice, about the blood covering anymore. It's common. That's no big deal. That's what that means. If you treat what God did for us as a common thing, it results in judgment. It's right there. It's in Hebrews. Does that make sense? I wanted us to kind of understand that. Because when God made this covenant, it was everlasting, and it was with everybody, not just Jews. The blood of the covenant, of the threshold covenant that was around forever, was put around the door, and you had to make the conscious choice to be inside that house. You had to accept the covenant. If you didn't, you were one of the ones who had to suffer the judgment, the last plague. Someone in your house, firstborn, would die. So Passover is protection and covering for individuals. It's not the same thing as the Day of Atonement, which is the atonement for the nations. This is individual. And this is where Christ comes in as our sacrifice lamb. So we're going to show you how this happened. How Jesus, as he lived out his final week, fulfilled everything that happened in Exodus. And then God wanted us to remember that over and over, because he goes, you're going to see this happen one day. This is dress rehearsal. Every year do this, because one day there's going to be somebody fulfill this. And if you don't do it, you're not going to recognize it. So we're going to start with how the Passover lamb was selected. Back in Exodus, it says, tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of the month, each man shall take a lamb for his family, each for his household. So we have to wait. We have to spot the moon, recognize the first day of the month, count in 10 days, you go pick a lamb. This is when the high priest on the temple would leave and go select a lamb in Bethlehem. This went on, started in Exodus, and went all the way up to the time of Christ. When the lamb was selected by the Pharisees, by the Jewish, at that time, the temple processions, the priest would be on the Temple Mount, he would do his thing, and he would leave, and they would lay down palm branches. No one was allowed to walk on this road now until the high priest comes back with the sacrifice. At the same time, on the 10th day of the month, we're going to read here in John, there they made him supper, and Martha served, but Lazarus was one of the ones who sat at the table with him. Mary took a pound of very costly oil and spikenard, anointed the feet of Jesus, and wiped his feet with her hair. And the house was filled with the fragrance of oil. Now, we know this story. It's sweet because she anoints him with, this oil, and wipes his feet with his hair, which is submission. But this actually happened on the 10th day of that month, too. She was marking the lamb. She was selecting the lamb for sacrifice. This is what happened there. It's in all four Gospels. Now, the triumphal entry is what I was just talking about. We're going to read these. These things that have been done in the triumphal entry of Jesus are the very things that had been done as part of the temple service in selecting the Passover lamb. David was a prophet who put all of these prophetic shadow pictures in place, and now the Son of David is fulfilling these holy rehearsals, just as Israel had rehearsed them from the time that Solomon dedicated the temple. Paul declared a mystery that had been hidden from both the disciples and from the princes of the world. For if they had known that the feast of God were all prophetic shadow pictures of good things to come, they would have never crucified Jesus, which means they forgot. By that time, some of them considered that a common thing. They weren't paying attention. So Hebrews 10:1 says, "The law is only a shadow of good things that are coming, not the realities themselves. For this reason, it can never, by the same sacrifice repeated endlessly year after year, make perfect those who draw near to worship." And in 1 Corinthians, "Now we declare God's wisdom, a mystery that has been hidden, that God destined for our glory before time began. None of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would not have crucified the Lord of glory." What that's saying is if these guys would have recognized Christ living out the very things that they were practicing and remembering, they wouldn't have crucified him, because they would have recognized their Messiah. But what to them was an ordinance set up by God to remember forever, they turned it into a religion. It was just common. This is our program handed out at the beginning of church. It's going to take 70 minutes to finish. This is what we do. We don't know why, we just do it. And they forgot. They took their eye off of the Messiah. So Jesus comes in now. I'm going to explain this because the high priest would leave the Temple Mount, go out, and head towards Bethlehem, which is about 5 miles. And it's not flat. It's very rocky, very hard to get there. But that's where the lambs were being held. That's where the shepherd's field was. We know that from the birth story of Christ. It's where they were. No one was allowed to walk on this street until the high priest comes back in with his sacrifice lamb. So what happens is over the years, since David and Solomon, they set this out, these people knew our atonement sacrifice is coming. We need to be ready. And the streets of Jerusalem are skinny. They're not very wide. And there's millions of people there. So it was rehearsed. People were waiting at the gate because he had to come in through a specific gate. And as soon as the high priest would walk in, usually on a donkey, because he didn't want to ruin the perfect lamb he had found, the people waiting at the gate would start yelling the Hosanna or Hoshiana, which means Lord save us in Hebrew. Once that crowd started saying that, it had a chain reaction effect through the whole city of Israel. And the whole city started yelling it, even if they couldn't see it. So the people who knew who he was, knew the lamb was coming in, they would start saying that, and then the chain reaction would go off. So as the high priest leaves to go get the lamb, here comes Christ riding on a donkey. And that's not an accident, because in 1 Kings, Solomon was anointed king. He rode in on David's mule. The king is here. And the people who were following Christ recognized that. So they start yelling, Lord save us, Hoshiana, Hosanna. And the crowd erupts. The city starts throwing the palm branches and leaves, and he's riding in on the donkey just like Solomon did, the anointed king. And what happened was some of the people didn't even know that. They couldn't see him. Like I said, the streets are very narrow. So once the procession ended, people started going about their business. Some of them probably went home. Then here comes the high priest back with his lamb. And nobody's there to greet him, because Christ took all of the glory already. So that's how he fulfilled that. And then the process starts. He spends the next couple of days, the 11th and the 12th of the month, the first biblical month, teaching and cleansing the temple, cursing the fig trees, performing miracles, and making leaders angry. We read that in the Gospels. On the 12th day, the inspection of the lamb begins by different sects and ending with the high priest. They would do this with the actual physical lamb. They would take it up and tie it on the Temple Mount. And then the Sadducees, the Pharisees, all of the other people, the townspeople, would come up and inspect it and try to find something wrong with it. because if it had a spot or a blemish, it couldn't be the sacrifice lamb. So they let somebody see if this is right. It has to be perfect. At the same time, Jesus begins being questioned and tried by the city leaders. They're doing the same thing to him. They're testing him. They're asking him questions. What about this? What about trying to find something wrong with him? Trying to find something wrong with his theology so they can say, aha, I found something wrong with you. While the physical lamb is on the Temple Mount being questioned and scrutinized, Christ is over here being questioned and scrutinized. They're following the same procedures. On the final inspection of the lamb was completed by the priest, he declared, I would find no fault with this lamb. He shall be our sacrifice. And we hear that when Jesus passed between Pharisees, the Herodians, the Sadducees, the scribes, he goes before the high priest, the Sanhedrin, the king, and then Pilate. And Pilate ultimately says, what? I find no fault in this man. He didn't know what he was doing. He was a Roman. But he was the highest ranking person in Jerusalem at that point. So every one of them questioned him. Even Herod, I don't see nothing wrong with him. He might be crazy, but send him away. So every one of them couldn't find anything wrong with Christ. Even Pilate's like, I find no fault in this man. The highest ranking person said the same thing the high priest did for 1,000 years. This is our lamb. And they didn't even know they were doing it. So, the Last Supper happens. The Last Supper was before Passover. It's not the Passover meal. It was the night before, because Christ was the Passover sacrifice. This was not the Passover, and it was on the 14th day of the first month. John 13. Now before the feast of Passover, when Jesus knew that his hour was come, that he should depart out of the world unto the Father, having loved his own which were in the world, he loved them unto the end. And supper being ended, the devil having now put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him. When they were eating, Jesus took some bread after the blessing, and he broke it and gave it to the disciples, saying, take and eat, this is my body. And when he had taken some of the cup and gave thanks, he said to them, drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood of the covenant, which is poured out for many for the forgiveness of sins. I say unto you, I will not drink of the fruit of the vine now, until the day I come and drink it new with you in my Father's kingdom. I want you to remember a couple things here. Take and eat, this is my body. This is what we know as communion, right? There's more to it than this. Drink from it, all of you, for this is my blood. Blood of the covenant. We already talked about the covenant. Covenant was made on the threshold. Enter my Father's house. Covenant around the door. So remember those. Now this is a calendar of that particular week. The month of the Aviv is a stage of barley. It's the first month of the year. Right here, I don't know if you can read that. This is the Sabbath dinner in Bethany where Jesus' feet were anointed. And then on the 10th day is when he goes in to Jerusalem. The first 2 days is where he's teaching and upsetting everybody. These 2 days here. Right here, on the 13th, this is where he starts being questioned, 13 and 14, and on the end of the 14th day here, it's where he's crucified. That's also the Passover lambs were sacrificed. And they were sacrificed at 3 p.m., the same time he dies. The Feast of Unleavened Bread begins that evening, so when you're eating the Passover lamb, you're starting the Feast of Unleavened Bread. And it says you eat it. If you remember in Exodus, eat this with unleavened bread. And it goes through unleavened bread the week, the 7 days. Unleavened bread ends here. The first fruits, we'll talk about that in a minute. But I wanted to show you this calendar so you can get an idea. Now I want to talk a minute about Christ on the cross, the Passover. I'm not going to focus on the amount of damage that he took and the torture he had to go through. We all know that. But on the cross, he says this, my God, why have you forsaken me? Have you read that? Do you know where that shows up first? In Psalm 22. Jesus is quoting this on the cross. My God, why have you forsaken me? Why are you so far from helping me and from the words of my groaning? My God, I cry in the daytime, but you do not hear, and in the night season, and am not silent. But you are holy, enthroned in the praises of Israel. Our father trusted you. They trusted, and you delivered them. They cried, and you were delivered. They trusted you, and were not ashamed. But I am a worm, and no man, a reproach of men, and despised by all people. Now we can see that this is Christ, right? And go home and read the entire thing of Psalm 22. It's powerful. We're going to come back to it, but I want to stop there for a minute and talk about this worm thing. Why did he call himself a worm? Most teachings think because he set himself lower than man. That's true to an aspect, but all animals are below men. Right? Man is given dominion over the earth, so he could have called himself a rabbit, and that would have been below man. But he picked a worm. And it's not because it's gross. If he'd have wanted something gross, he'd have picked a roach or something like that. A maggot. But he picked a worm. So, I did study on this. And most of you probably won't care to see this or can see it, but this is the original Hebrew. The word worm right there is tola'at. It's in the Strong's. That's 8438. That's the word that was used there. That's not the traditional word for worm, like a maggot type worm. This is a specific type of worm. And right here, it means crimson, purple, or worm. It is also used in Exodus when the people gathered too much manna and it developed worms. It was this worm, a specific one. God didn't want them gathering too much manna. He wanted them to trust him. So I'm going to send a worm to destroy all the overstock that you got. And it's going to be that worm. So what does this mean? That is the crimson worm, or the coccus ilcus, the coccus worm. I'm going to talk a minute about this, because he referred to himself as this particular worm. This is a picture of it. This is a picture of it in its cocoon stage. Okay? It sticks on the branches there. Here's some more pictures. They're really tiny. They almost look like some kind of sea animal, but these are all these coccus worms. Now what they do in Israel, they harvest these. Does anybody knows when they harvest snails to get the blue color for the threads? They used to take snails out of water, and if you opened them up in the daylight, it would give you either a purple or a blue dye, and they would use that for their robes. These they would harvest to get a crimson color. So this is actually going on right now in Israel. This is a guy who sticks one of these worms right there in boiling water, and it ultimately starts turning red. Okay? Now we're going to go through this and pay attention, because understand who Christ is, what he did for us, what he said to us, what he said at the Last Supper, and think about this. The Hebrew word for worm is ramah, which means maggot. But the Hebrew word Jesus used for worm was tola'ath, which means crimson or scarlet worm. It looks more like a grub than a worm anyway. When it is time for the crimson worm to reproduce, which it only does one time in its life, it finds the trunk of a tree or a wooden fence post or a stick. It then attaches its body to the wood and makes a hard crimson shell. It is so strongly and permanently stuck to the wood that the shell cannot be removed without tearing its body completely apart or killing it. You can already see where this is going, right? The crimson worm lays its eggs under its body as a protective shell. When the larvae hatch, they stay under the shell. The mother's body gives protection for her babies and also provides them with food, which is her own living body. And what does Christ say? Take and eat. This is my body. I am the worm. Take and drink. This is my blood. I am the worm. After a few days of feeding on the living mother's body, the young worms grow and the mothers die. It then secretes a crimson or red dye that stains the wood it's attached to and covers the young. The scarlet covering protects them from predators, and it stains them red for the rest of their lives. This is what it looks like when you harvest these worms off of the tree. And what does that resemble? Christ says, I am the worm. I am the scarlet worm. I will protect my kids. They take and eat. This is my body. And when I die, my blood will cover you. I will protect you from predators. We're not done yet. 1 John, if we walk in the light as he is the light, we have fellowship with one another, and the blood of Christ, his Son, cleansed from all sin. After dying to give life to its children, something amazing takes place. For a period of 3 days, the worm can be scraped from the tree, and the crimson gel can be used to make a dye. This dye was the same dye used in the tabernacle and the garments of the high priest. For 3 days, you could harvest this dead worm, and they would take the dye, and it would actually be the covering of the Old Testament tabernacle. It was red. And they also used it in the garments of the high priest. That's just coincidence, right? For as Jonah was 3 days and 3 nights in the belly of the fish, the Son of Man will be 3 days and 3 nights in the heart of the earth. By the morning of the 4th day, when the worm has pulled its head and tail together, it now is in the shape of a heart. And it starts losing its crimson color and is now turning into a wax, which is white like snow. And what does Jesus say in Psalm 22? I am poured out like water. All of my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax. It is melted within me. And then in Isaiah, come now, let us reason together, says the Lord. Though your sins be as scarlet, they are now white as snow. For they are red like crimson, they shall be as wool. I am the worm. Everything he did was right there in the life cycle, and we can see everything in God in nature. This is why he said, I am this worm. I will feed my children with my body. I will protect them and cover them with my blood. It shall protect them against predators until they can stand on their own. And then they can harvest the blood, because I'll be the high priest, and their scarlet sins will be white as snow. Did you ever heard that before? You know, it's not an accident. You can't make this up, and all you got to do is, see it. It's so much more than him saying, I'm lower than man. He was giving you an example, a physical example, and they would have known that because this worm grows in the Middle East. It grows in Israel. They're harvesting it now. Those pictures I showed you of them mixing it in the water, that's from the Temple Institute. Now, these Jews don't believe that Christ is the Messiah. They're trying to build the third temple. They're making the garments for the high priest. They're harvesting this worm because they know this worm, if we gather it within 3 days after its death, we can color our high priest's robe red. This is Jews doing this today. God knew. He hides himself in plain sight. In nature, we just got to see it. Right? So, we can stop there, but we ain't done yet. Right? It is finished. When he's on the cross and he says, I am the worm, this is done. After this, Jesus, knowing that all things had accomplished, that the scripture might be fulfilled, he said, I thirst. And a vessel full of sour wine was sitting there, and they filled with a sponge, sour wine, and put it on hyssop. And they put it into his mouth. So when Jesus had received the sour wine, he said, it is finished. Bowing his head, he gave up his spirit. I bolded the word hyssop there because I want to pay attention to that word. We go back to Leviticus. He shall take the cedar wood, the hyssop, the scarlet, and the living bird, and dip them in the blood of the slain bird and the running water, and sprinkle them on the house 7 times. And he shall cleanse the house with the blood of the bird and the running water, and the living bird with the cedar wood, the hyssop, and the scarlet. Now, whenever you see this word scarlet, you're going to think of that worm, right? Because they coexist. He shall let the living bird loose outside the city and make atonement for the house, and it shall be clean. Go back to Exodus. Moses called for all the elders of Israel and said to them, pick out the lambs for yourselves according to the families, and kill the Passover lamb. And you shall take the bunch of hyssop, dip it in the blood that is in the basin, strike the lintel and the 2 doorposts with the blood in the basin, and none of you shall go out the door of the house until morning. So the covenant of blood that was made on the doorpost, they took hyssop branches. They were told to make sure you use hyssop branches, dip it in the basin, and put it around the door. In the temple service, they're told, make sure when you do this, use hyssop branches. Go back to that thing on the cross. Christ says, I thirst. They offered him a sponge with a hyssop branch. Why? I mean, you can't make this stuff up, He's fulfilling everything as it was set out. The covenant was made. He's on a cross. There's blood already down at the feet. There's blood on the sides. There's blood at the top. Right? And they give him the hyssop branch to finish it off. All this happens, if you think of that, he's put in the ground after this. We're going to go over a map here in a minute of that week. But sunset, Passover, they have to hurry up and get him off the cross because the sun is setting and they're not allowed to work on a Sabbath day. So they stick him in the ground. And he wasn't buried properly. 3 days he's in the ground. 3 full days, not Friday to Sunday. Jesus says in the Bible, are there not 12 hours in a day and 12 hours in a night? That's 72 hours, 3 days. I don't care what the Catholics say. Okay? 3 days, 3 nights. On the 4th day, he rises. On the 4th day, that little worm turns white. Right? Go all the way back to Genesis. To rule over the day and the night, and to divide the light from the darkness. God saw the light was good, and the evening and the morning were the 4th day. The day the light was separated from darkness was the 4th day. You can't make this stuff up. I mean, we see this as the sun and moon, yeah. But everything in nature reflects the spiritual. On the 4th day, light was divided from darkness, and he forever rules as king. Right? And that 4th day was FirstFruits. The day set aside to offer your first fruit of the ground, your first fruit of anything to God. First fruits always falls on the day after the Sabbath, which is always Sunday. The Sabbath day is always Saturday. First fruits is always Sunday. We come to church on Sunday, we should be offering our first fruits of that week to God. Always. There's people who say you shouldn't worship on Sunday, but that's the day you offer your first fruits. We're supposed to be resting on the Sabbath and offering our first fruits on Sunday. This is why we come to church. Okay, I'm almost done. During the crucifixion, when he died and gave up his spirit, not when they killed him, the earthquakes, the temple veil was torn, and the graves of the firstfruits were marked. If you read it closely, Jesus cried out again with a loud voice and yielded up his spirit. And behold, the veil of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. And the earth quaked, and the rocks split, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints who had fallen asleep were raised. And coming out of their graves after his resurrection, they went into the holy city and appeared to many. You have to read this whole thing in context, because the graves were opened when he died. The people didn't get out and start walking around until after his resurrection. That's what it says. So there weren't like zombies walking around when Jesus has died. It wasn't like that. What would happen in that time period, the high priest, after the lamb was sacrificed, they would walk across the bridge of the Kidron Valley to the Mount of Olives, which it's pretty steep. They would walk across and they would find, it was called an omer of barley. It's a sheave like this big, and they would tie it off. This is ripe. I'm going to tie this off. They go over and they do another one. This is ripe. I'm marking this, because in 3 days, I'm going to come out of seclusion. On the 4th day, I'm going to come and grab these and take them back and offer them in the temple. That's what he did. The priest himself would select. I want this. I want this. I want that. Nobody touch that. Those are mine, because I'm going to offer those to God on the first day. So what happens, then he would go into seclusion in Mount Moriah for 3 days. Christ dies. He's put in the tomb in Mount Moriah for 3 days. The barley is marked. The graves were opened. They were marked. He's saying, hey, when I arise, I'm taking these guys with me. I'm marking these. These are mine. These were the Old Testament saints. But he's like, don't touch them. And Jews knew not to touch a dead body, so they would back far away from any opened up grave. Like, I'm not going over there. And Christ is saying, I'm coming to get those. Just give me a few days. So here we go. This is the week. Right here it says Christ, the Passover meal happens on this day, which is Wednesday. Wednesday night. This is separated night and day. That's the way time has always been. We have that concept too. Our day starts at midnight. But over there, the day starts when the sun goes down. So the sun goes down, Passover meal, Passover lamb is killed, Passover meal is eaten. Oops. They had to put him in the ground here before sunset. There's the night. Here's the day. This is when he dies. He's right here, 9 a.m. He dies at 3 p.m. right here. So they have this little window of time right here to take him off the cross and prepare him for burial before the sun goes down, because this day, the next day, is Day of Unleavened Bread. It's a Sabbath. You can't work. You can't buy anything. No stores are open. You're not going to be able to buy burial spices or burial robes or anything. Nobody's going to sell you anything. So they, in a hurry, they have to hurry up and get the tomb ready. We got to stick him in there before sundown, because the next day is a Sabbath. They have to wait the whole Sabbath day right here until the sun sets. Then they have a day on Friday, from Friday or Thursday evening to Friday day. That's a free day. That's when Mary and them go and start buying and getting everything ready, trying to get everything proper so they can bury him again. And all of a sudden, wham, they're up against the weekly Sabbath. They have to stop and wait. So they have a whole day of getting everything prepared, then they got to wait, which is why Mary was anxious. As soon as it was dark, as soon as the sun set, I'm going, because it's another free day. I can bury him. And that's why whenever they get here, the sun sets, she arrives at the tomb, it's still dark, and he's already up. He didn't rise in the morning when the sunlight hit. Because when Mary got to the tomb, it was still dark. She was waiting for the sun, probably, come on, and then running to it. I can get him now. We can bury him properly now, but he's already up. So here's your 3 days and 3 nights. Sunset on Wednesday to sunset on Saturday. There is a period of time between the sun setting and you see the 3 stars that lets you know the next day has started. That's called twilight. It's when the lambs were killed. That's when he was put in the tomb, and that's when he rose. He rose on the Sabbath day because he's the Lord of the Sabbath. The Son of Man is also the Lord of the Sabbath. Jesus rose on the Sabbath. He's the Lord of the Sabbath. He rose on the Sabbath and forever owns it. Sabbath is a day of rest. He's the Lord of rest. Come unto me, all you who burden, and I will give you rest. That's why he says that. So, on the first of the week, Mary Magdalene went to the tomb early, and it was still dark. And she saw that the stone had been taken away from the tomb. That's a little different story than we're saying, as soon as the sun comes up, Jesus rolls away the stone. But she gets there, it's still dark. So she waited. She waited until the sun went down and ran. That's how I picture her, just being anxious. I got to get to my Savior and bury him properly. And when she gets there, he's gone. It's still dark out. Is that not what it says? And Jesus says to her, Mary. She turned to him and said, Rabboni, which is rabbi or teacher. And he says, do not touch me, for I have not yet ascended to my Father. But go tell my brethren and say to them, I am ascending to my Father and to your Father and to my God and to your God. So we're going to go over this again. Why did he say this? Now think about the priest marking the omer, marking the wheat. Think about the graves being opened. The high priest was to be in seclusion in the priest chambers in the Temple Mount for the time of the marking of the firstfruits on the Mount of Olives until they presented the firstfruits in the temple on the morning of firstfruits. Likewise, Jesus was in seclusion in the same mountain for 3 days in a grave, and in his seclusion he was not yet finished when he forbade Mary from touching him after his resurrection. Later that morning, he presented the firstfruits offerings to his Father at the throne in heaven, and he allowed others to touch him, for the time of seclusion was finished. So he tells Mary, don't touch me, because I haven't gone and gathered my firstfruit offering yet and taken them up to my Father, while the priest hadn't went over and gathered the wheat and took it to the temple. So he had to go gather these guys who were walking around Jerusalem saying, hey fellas, let's go. I got to offer you up. I am now the high priest. I'm that worm. And I'm going to offer you up to the temple in heaven, to my Father. So don't touch me yet, because I still have to fulfill the role. And what would happen if someone would have touched a priest before he'd have done that? He'd have been unclean, and it had to wait 3 more days, and everything would have been off. So he fulfilled that. I'm almost done. So what does he say? This part is cool. One time she gets back to tell everybody, hey, he's risen, and he shows up. The same day, it only took him however, a twinkling of an eye to ascend to heaven and offer the first fruits and come back down. This part is cool. Behold my hands and my feet, that is I myself, handle me, touch me. Here I am, you can touch me now. I'm the high priest, I've already offered my offering, handle me. That's what it said. See, for the spirit has not flesh and bone, and ye see me have. The fulfillment of the spring feasts are almost complete. Jesus, as the Kohen Gadol, which means high priest, after the order of Melchizedek, fulfilled the rehearsal as it was prophetically put in place by the prophet David, who foresaw the coming of the Messiah. David saw it coming. He set this temple thing in place and said, pay attention. We're doing this for a reason. You know, I practice with follower. And we rehearse songs. We rehearse songs that we wrote over and over and over and over. Because when it comes time to play them, we need to know them. And when it comes time to do the show, we need to recognize, okay, that song's ending, this one's beginning, and we know it. We ought to be able to do it in our sleep. I can play drums in my sleep because I've played them over and over and over. But when I lose sight, sometimes I do here. Sometimes I get bored or I'm thinking about something else, I'll drop a stick or something happens. All of us do that, you know. So all of this is how he was our sacrifice lamb. He was that worm that protected us and covered us. You know, he wasn't necessarily saying, I'm below man. He's saying, I am going to die for you. And I'm going to give you my body to eat and protect you with life. And then I'm going to be your high priest. And I'm going to offer you as my first fruits. And forever we will reign and rest.